The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation. Constituency Report is produced as a public service by members of the BC Legislature through the facilities of Shaw TV.
Hello and welcome to Constituency Report. I'm Sonia Furstenau, the Green MLA for Cowichan Valley. And today I'm going to interview David Moskrop with Simon Fraser University. David is a political science professor and he's just recently finished a book that's yet to be published on democracy. So we're going to talk with David about democracy. Welcome, David.
Hi.
So tell me a little bit about the book that you've just written.
So I wanted to know, can people make good political decisions? And okay, what does that mean? Because everyone thinks they make good decisions. Not a lot of people go around thinking, I'm going to make bad decisions today. They think, no, I'm going to go out, I'm going to make a good decision. But what does it mean to make a good political decision is what I wanted to know. So, okay, it's got to be rational. You know, it's got to be based on an understanding of the world. You go and collect the facts, you connect them, you get a sense of what's good, what's bad. And it has to be autonomous. And so by that I mean, you got to know where your motivations come from. So if you're choosing something for one reason, and that's the reason you think, you know, it's because I think that this fiscal policy is going to be good for taxpayers, but you're motivated by something else, it's a dislike of the other side. Well, then I'd say that's not a good political decision because you don't actually know why you're making it. So that was the question I wanted to look into. And so when you dig around, what you find is that people have the capacity to make great political decisions. They can understand issues. They can make up their minds. But often in our lives, our institutions, we're encouraged to make bad ones. Things are happening too quickly. There's too much information. People are trying to manipulate you. You don't have a chance to develop the skill set you need to do this because making good political decisions takes practice, takes time, takes resources. And so in a sense, we are capable of making good political decisions, but we're often encouraged to make bad ones. And on its face, that's not necessarily a problem, unless the sort of outcomes you get in your democracy start to look like they perhaps don't reflect people's true preferences, or they do a disservice to the institutions that keep democracy alive. And so the question is, how do we empower people so they can basically take back decision-making for themselves?
And it's so relevant right now with all that's come out about Cambridge Analytica, and when you say about collecting the facts, I mean, we, as you say, are overwhelmed by information, overwhelmed by facts, and now we are in a place of doubting what kind of facts are being put in front of us and the kind of manipulation that's happening. So in the face of that, I mean, this all happened while you were writing the book, right?
Yeah, so democracy only works if we have a broadly shared world. If we can at least agree on some basic stuff, and if we can trust that the facts that we're getting about the world are reliable. And it becomes a really big problem if you can start to choose your facts based on what you happen to already believe. And if you think, well, my truth is different than your truth and we're never going to meet, so it's just a matter of battling it out and whoever wins, wins, but I'm not going to try to meet you in the middle, I'm not going to try to persuade you, I'm just going to try to beat you. That becomes a problem because that's less democracy than it is sort of either mobocracy or sometimes just downright thuggery. So the question is, well, how do we reestablish this sort of shared world where things make sense and we can rely on our news sources, we can rely on someone out in the world that we look to and say, okay, well, I trust that person, and we can all trust them together. It's not obvious to me that it's going to be easy to fix that because it means we're going to have to find a way to regulate platforms to make sure that people aren't using them to manipulate, to micro-target ads, for instance, which is a huge problem. You can show one thing to one person, a different thing to another, and the two will never know what they're being, what the other's seeing. But then also building, citizen capacity so that people can push back on their own. But that's not going to be enough because you can't rely on individuals to do all the work. They've got other things to do with their life. And then you get into, okay, well, now we need to protect the media space. How do we rebuild the media now that digital media is on the rise and traditional media is declining? Okay, well, that's going to be a tough thing. And on top of it all, how do we get political parties and politicians to behave too? Because it's sometimes tempting to say, well, everyone else is doing it, we're going to do it too. So you've got to find a way to get everyone back into line and committed to producing a good democratic space rather than just winning.
Yeah, it's a steep hill to climb right now. And when you talked about, you touched on citizens right there. How important is that kind of citizen connectivity and citizen action in all of this? And where does that play out in a world where we are getting such polarizing messaging and these targeted advertising, as you say? How do we ensure that we're coming together in our communities and actually making that the forum for democracy?
So if we start with the question, like, what's a good democracy? My argument would be a good democracy is one where you've got regular, free, and fair elections and a more or less responsive government. So in the long run, the government does more or less what the people want it to do. We're like, well, how do you get that? The first one is easy. We know how to get the first one. How do you get the second one? Well, you need to find some way to translate what people want into outcomes. So, like, imagine there's two spheres. There's the public sphere where people live their lives, decide what they think is good or bad or what they want. And then there's the formal government sphere where people make decisions. Like, how do we translate preferences from this into policy? Part of it is you need citizens who have the capacity and the opportunity to form their political preferences and to share them with the government, and to make sure that they get what they want. That means that we have to distribute power and opportunity in a more or less equal way so that everybody's got a fair shot. Right now, we don't have that. Right now, we have biased power, concentrations of power. We need to return that back to people and give them the skills they can use to then communicate their interests and their preferences to government. That means we need participatory spaces in our politics, right? We need more than town halls or meetings with MLAs or MPs or whatever. We need citizens' assembly or citizen juries, or the occasional referendum when it's absolutely necessary. Or regular channels of feedback or participatory budgeting, for instance. These things where people can come and practice their skills and communicate their preferences. And then this is the critical bit, then government has to be responsive. It's all well and good to have all the participatory stuff, but if it never gets picked up by government, then people start to say, is this democracy washing? Are you just trying to make it look like you care and then you're going to do whatever? Then they become cynical, more cynical.
And cynicism is really such a dangerous place to go in democracy because, as we've seen, we've had lower voter turnouts. We have people who think it doesn't matter who's elected. They all do the same. And so that cynicism really erodes democracy.
In a few ways. Absolutely. So the one is the trust starts to break down. And if we don't trust each other, then we can't have a democracy. Because then you start to say, well, I don't think the system works. I don't trust you. So what I'm going to do is whatever it takes to win. So then we start to see norms erode, the sort of soft rules that we have, or the unwritten rules we have about how we should behave and how we shouldn't behave. People start to say, why should I bother? I don't. This is the deck is the deck is stacked, or we've been caught out for so long that we can do anything to get in. It's sort of a bit of what the populist message is. And that can get really nasty really quickly. And then the third is, at some point, if everybody checks out, then the sort of policies and laws that you're getting aren't going to be reflective of what people want, because you're not going to know what they are.
Right.
And it's only going to be the ones who speak up. And some people say, well, look, it should be the ones who show up who get to decide. That's all well and good to say, but people have a funny way of deciding for themselves whether or not they're pleased with what their government's doing, whether they've shown up or not. And then what you get is a cycle. So then trust starts to decline, then cynicism starts to increase, and things end up much worse. And you start to see what's happening in countries like the United States, right? It gets to a point where it gets particularly nasty, and you risk someone coming in and saying, well, I'll fix things.
Right. Yeah.
And let me tell you how. And then people start to say, well, okay, fine, if this strong leader is going to fix things, and we care less about whether or not there's regular, free, fair elections. We care less about whether or not the tactics are completely in line with our norms or even the rule of law. We just want to get things done.
Right. And that leads us to some very dangerous places. And I want to step into that kind of conversation around protecting democracy. We always hear democracy is fragile and it's precious and we need to protect it. But I think sometimes we think that just means keeping everything exactly the same. But over time and over history, certainly democracy evolves. So do you have some examples of how democracy has changed over its lifespan, particularly Westminster parliamentary democracy?
Yeah, so democracy is historically pretty weird. Most societies have not been democratic, and when they have been, they haven't lasted that long.
Right.
Athens lasted, ancient Athens, something like 186 years or something, and it was a highly participatory democracy, but only for men who were citizens.
Right.
So the percentage of people who were actually participating was a handful, maybe 10 or 15%. And it was women and slaves and foreigners who were doing all the work to actually enable men to go participate in politics.
Right.
So the history of democracy is very slow and long history of bringing more and more people in. So then democracy, then there's the Roman Republic. You know, it's sort of democratic. It lasts about 500 years. It falls. Europe goes into a dark feudal age. Then you start to have the evolution of Westminster democracy in England in the late medieval. But again, men, propertied men who want their rights. They want in. You know, they say, okay, well, we don't like the idea that the king is deciding everything for himself. We want in. So they start to take a little bit of power back. And then we have this long trajectory of that becoming more inclusive and more representative over the course of hundreds of years. And in the case of Canada, mostly less violent, except for some extreme cases in which violence against Indigenous peoples is a huge and extremely disappointing and in some senses ongoing exception. But it is still this process of slowly bringing people in. But you don't really get to mass democracy in the way that we think of it until maybe the 1960s. But by the time that Indigenous people can vote, women can vote, younger people can vote. I mean, it takes a really long time. We've only been practicing sort of mass inclusive democracy for several decades, and it has never been fully inclusive.
Right.
So, you know, we still haven't figured it out. And there's this idea that, well, we've got it and so we can't lose it. And that's the tip of the spear, because every democratic society that has ever existed has fallen into tyranny.
Right. So that's a real danger that we have to be mindful of.
Historically speaking, I mean, there's no reason to think that it couldn't happen to us, given that it's happened to everyone else.
Right. Is inclusivity, is bringing more people into that democracy one of the ways to protect it fully against that kind of fall to tyranny?
Absolutely. You know, strong institutions and strong norms. We have to have, you know, rules that people respect, rules they feel included, the rules that they think are fair. We have to have our opportunities for them to be heard, for the government to be responsive, and we have to have norms that everybody says, okay, well, there's just some things we're not going to do because maybe you could get away with doing it, and maybe it would help you today, it benefits you today, but in the long run, it's going to be awful, and it's going to erode this thing that we're trying to do here. So the walls are slowly going to start to erode, and eventually they come down, and then it's a free-for-all. So, you know, it's when you see democracy collapse, it's often because inequality has grown out of control.
Right.
And it's because power has become too concentrated in the hands of the few. Wealth inequality is often linked to that too. It's not just power. Of course, wealth and power go together. So the question is like, okay, how do we bring people in to make sure that they feel included, that they think the rules are fair, and that their preferences are being respected in policy and law? That requires regular consultation with people and uptake of the stuff that they want. It's a real conceit to think that, you know, the experts or the elites can do it all on their own.
Right.
Historically speaking, that lasts for a little while, but it falls apart.
This is really interesting. We're going to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about wealth, inequality, democracy, and specifically to what's happening in BC right now. So this is a short break from the Constituency Report. There's going to be some information about how to get in touch with my constituency office, and we'll be back after a few moments. Welcome back to Shaw Constituency Report. I'm Sonia Furstenau, Green MLA for Cowichan Valley, and I'm here today with David Moscrop, a political scientist from Simon Fraser University, and we're having a really interesting conversation about democracy. And we're going to segue over into specifically BC right now, because inequality is something that I talk about a lot in the House, in my speeches and in the debates in the chamber. And you know, I'm a historian as well, and I've studied the impacts of inequality on any society. It's a very destabilizing force. And we know that inequality has really grown in BC over the last few decades. So can you look at specifically how that's playing out in BC, and then I want to move to electoral reform after that.
Sure. I mean, I think if you look at the last couple of years of British Columbia politics, especially the last year, there's been a real shift from a focus on growing the economy and AAA credit ratings or even jobs to affordability. Mm-hmm. You know, the new watchword is affordability. And I think that reflects the fact that people are starting to say, well, if the economy is growing, mm-hmm. but it doesn't work for me, then does it really matter that the economy is growing? Mm-hmm. If I can't afford to pay my rent or to own a home, to send my kids to school, to make sure that I can pay my prescriptions or whatever it may be, then what's all this for? Then they start to get a little bit angry. They start to think, well, this system is fixed. Mm-hmm. That goes back to the sort of erosion of trust question and cynicism and the rest of it. So the question is, okay, well then, how do we bring people back in? How do we make sure that this inequality doesn't contribute to eroding the foundations of the whole democracy? Mm-hmm. Because, like, what are we here for? What is the thing that we're doing? What's the point of living together? Mm-hmm. You know, if we start from that question, the point is, well, we can do things together that we can't do on our own. But people have to actually feel like they're getting that stuff done and that they're getting a fair deal. Otherwise, they're not going to respect the system, and you're going to have, well, at least a metaphorical rebellion, if not a literal one. And then, so that's the sort of political story. The other side is, at the very least, as a matter of social justice, nobody should live a wretched life. It's just, right. It is just the fundamental principle, I think, of first fundamental principle of democracy is that everyone who lives in that democracy has a right to a decent standard of living, just as a human being who's endowed with dignity, and it's the very least that we can do. When inequality gets out of control, and especially when politicians start to drift away from that fundamental mandate, people get left behind.
Yeah, and that's a real danger. And I know trust is also so important, and it's what sort of launched my political life was our community lost trust in the decision-making processes. Right. So we have a couple of approaches to democratic reform that are out in the ether right now mm-hmm. in BC, and one of them is reducing the voting age to 16, so giving 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote. So give me your thoughts on that.
I wish I had more sophisticated thoughts than it's a slam dunk and we should do it. Right. Go talk to some 16-year-olds. Don't just go pick up a caricature of the generation that you see on television or on the internet, or you hear from a friend at a dinner. Go talk to these people mm-hmm. and ask them about politics. Like, take 10 minutes, and if you know a young person who's 15, 16, 17, go and talk to them. They might tell you at first, well, I'm not political, I don't care. Fine. Lots of people say that.
Yeah.
Okay, then say, well, what do you think about this issue? What do you think about schools? What do you think about your future and jobs? What do you think about the environment? Mm-hmm. What do you think about X, Y, or Z? You find out that they have pretty sophisticated political opinions and capacity. Mm-hmm. And then you realize they absolutely should be voting. Mm-hmm. Because there's no reason to deny a 16-year-old who has plenty of capacity the right to vote, mm-hmm. other than we happen to have arbitrarily set the age right. at 18. Right? That comes out of nowhere. We don't know, there's nothing yeah. buried in the literature that says this is the moment you become an adult. And I mean, frankly, this is such a tired argument, but I think it gets at something. It's if you can drive at 16, quite frankly, a car is more dangerous than a vote. Yeah. And we trust people
quite
with cars.
Quite a bit more, yeah. Yeah, and I was a high school teacher before I got elected, and I think that there's this extraordinary opportunity to combine civics education, political education with that first experience of voting. And it provides that kind of capacity for people to make informed voting choices in their first ever election, which then translates to their whole life.
And creates a habit. Imagine if you get someone at 16, they haven't formed all their life habits yet, they haven't formed all their prejudices or all their opinions or all their commitments yet, yeah. They're still working out who they are, but they're thinking about that stuff mm-hmm. actively. And you've got them all in one place mm-hmm. where you can have a civics class that says, okay, we're going to talk about elections, and then, oh, guess what? You're going to actually have a chance to go and vote as well on mm-hmm. top of that. And then you create a norm. It becomes a habit and a habit and a norm as it happens, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, this is the thing you should do, voting. Mm-hmm. And oh, by the way, this is a thing that you just do because you've been doing it since you were 16, in the yeah. same way that you've been, checking your mirrors before you get in your car. since you were 16. And so I think often a lot of the opposition comes from people who say, well, we think this is a partisan thing. The evidence I've seen suggests that 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds are no more likely to vote for one party than another. They sort of mirror the general population. So there's actually no good reason to bar 16-year-olds from voting.
Absolutely not. And when I was a teacher, what I would do is bring in all the candidates of the election into my class so the students could interview those candidates themselves. And I think that would be the responsible approach to this, is you provide the students with all the information they need to understand the whole situation.
Absolutely, and in some senses, they're in a better position if they have good high school teachers to understand what's at stake in an election than some older folks who do have a vote and may not be paying attention, but who still cast a ballot. I mean, I think there should be no test, to decide whether or not you can vote.
Right.
Everyone has that right, and it's important that they exercise it, and it does a lot of good things that, having that right. But if you extend that logic, then I think you get to a point very quickly where you realize that you can't exclude 16-year-olds. No. It's a historical arbitrary prejudice. Right. I don't think 8-year-olds should vote. We need to draw the line somewhere. Yeah. But if you want to have an inclusive participatory democracy, you should draw that line as far as you can, so as to include as many people as you can. And so if you oppose it, I challenge you to think deeply about why you oppose it. And the only argument you're going to come to is, well, we don't think they can make good decisions. Go talk to a 16-year-old.
Yeah. The thing that drives me crazy about that argument is the same argument that was used to say women shouldn't have the vote. We can't trust them with it. They can't make good decisions. So that does not have any weight for me. I want to move on to our last topic, which is electoral reform. So there will be a referendum coming. We're waiting for the parameters of that. We haven't heard yet. But you've done a lot of thinking, a lot of writing on this topic, and I'd like to hear what you think about where we could go with electoral reform in BC.
So British Columbians have what is for most of the world a very unusual opportunity, and that's to have a say in how we decide how we elect our representatives. I mean, it's globally extremely uncommon for that to be. Here it's a little more common. This is the third time we've done it since 2005, but it's an extremely uncommon opportunity and a very powerful one, because citizens get to decide the rules of the game. And I think we should adopt rules of the game that create a legislature that is as inclusive of parties as possible, because those parties are going to reflect a broader range of people's commitments. So, vote on proportional representation, say it passes, whatever system maybe, we'll have a few more parties in the legislature probably. Not that many. People worry about how the whole thing's going to fall apart. That's not going to happen. If you're worried about that, I say to this, go look at New Zealand, go look at Germany, go look at Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Australia. I could go on. Some of the world's top democracies that are PR democracies, they do just fine. In fact, the only democracies that use our current system globally that are in the top few countries and democracies in the world are us and the United Kingdom. Right. The U.S. has been slipping recently for a number of reasons, including in part first past the post, which enables some of the nasty bits there to flourish. Yeah. But in BC now have opportunity to adopt a system that's used in 80-some countries across the world and reflects a legislature that has more options, more choice for people, and forces parties to work together, because a single party can't now take 39% of the vote based on a 65% turnout.
Right.
So a very small fraction of the actual number of citizens in the constituency, in the riding or the province or the country, and govern for them. You have these parties who've got to come together, bargain, and then reflect more of a will of the people, because they can't get away with governing for just 15% of the population.
That's right. And it seems that our current system pushes parties into a more polarized position, as you were saying at the beginning. And that, I think, undermines our capacity to do our best decision making, because when we come together and recognize the shared values, the shared beliefs, and the interests of the majority of the people, then we're going to make better decisions. So the polarizing impact right now, first past the post, is really visible both in our provincial and federal politics. Yeah,
so there's this old theory called Duverger's law that a first past the post tends to become a two-party system, left-right. It doesn't always work. In fact, in Canada, it's Duverger-ish, because we have two parties in a bit. But if you look at the parties who tend to win under first past the post, it's often a two-party system, give or take. And that encourages parties to dig into entrenched positions. You know, we're the red team, we're the blue team, we're the orange team, we're the green team, whatever the color may be, and they stake out their claim, and then they pivot a little bit left or right depending on the winds, which way the winds are blowing that particular day. But they have an interest in mostly capturing their likely voters and mobilizing those people. And so the calculus becomes something like this. You know, we win with 39% of the vote, and we know X percent of people are going to vote for us. So we need, you know, to get 39% of likely voters, and then you start targeting those people. And that ends up being a very small percentage of the population. And what do you do with the rest of people? You either ignore them, or worse, you actually try to demobilize them. You try to suppress them. You don't want them to turn out. So a lot of what we do during elections is about mobilizing, but a lot of it's also about demobilizing. And that's exactly contrary to what we want from a democracy. We want more people involved. We want to make sure that the electoral outcomes represent the will of as many people as possible, so that the sort of policies you get represent as many people as possible.
So the Cambridge Analytica, all of the kind of furor around that, and the part that I found most distressing was this idea that much of their efforts was in suppressing the vote, in getting people not to show up to vote. And that is such a worrying trend, as you point out. Electoral reform, proportional representation, I think, would be an antidote to that, in that people would say, at least my vote will count towards something.
Yeah, so PR systems tend to have higher voter turnout. And, you know, we don't know for sure why that is, but the theory is people think their vote's more likely to matter. And what does it mean for a vote to matter or a vote to count? I mean, in the literal sense, every vote is counted in our current system. Of course it is. But if you think of a vote counting as having a high likelihood to contribute to electing somebody who's going to represent a range of views that are broadly similar to your own, then PR tends to produce votes that count more, because you now contribute to electing a representative right now, where in many ridings 50-60% of people cast a ballot that elects no one. And we call those wasted votes. If you believe that a vote should not just go towards electing, it should not just be cast and then it counts no matter what, and there you go. But no, it actually should contribute to electing someone who's going to represent you. There's a lot of people who feel like they're not represented when they don't have someone from the party of their choice. Wouldn't it be nice if you did? And under PR, you probably would.
We have a couple of minutes left. But when you came in this morning and we were getting ready for this, you talked about Kinder Morgan and democracy. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, too, if you can sort of show how this is an example of where things might be a little askew.
Yeah, so a lot of people are saying the whole Kinder Morgan thing has been reflective of the breakdown of the rule of law or the circumventing of democracy, and that's just, or a sort of erosion of federalism. It's quite the opposite. You know, if you think of our system as a democratic system, you have elections and referendums and courts and protests and boycotts and the whole lot of it. And then you have a bunch of groups who are what we call pluralist democracy, who disagree about things. And what do? They go use whatever mechanisms they can use to get the job done. And as long as they respect the rule of law at the end of the day and follow the court orders, or, you know, whatever it may be, then you've got perfectly consistent activity with democracy and the rule of law, and that's what we have so far. No laws have been broken, aside from some protesters on the mountain, and they're going through the court system, and they're respecting the court system. Some norms have been pushed a little bit, but that's not unusual. Parties are going to push what parties think are good. Provinces are going to disagree. The federal government's going to try to do its thing. The provinces are going to try to do theirs. No one's raising a militia. It has been perfectly consistent with what we've been doing as a country for 150 years. And the market, in response, is sending signals to Kinder Morgan about whether or not they're comfortable going forward, and so far they're saying perhaps not. And that's a market response. And we think that's good too. We say, well, we want the market to signal what should be done. Well, that's what the market's doing. They might be signaling something that you don't particularly like if you're in favor of the pipeline. But too bad. If you believe in democracy, federalism, pluralism, and markets, all of those things are working perfectly as they're meant to work.
That's a great place to sort of wrap up. And I like the idea that, you know, we're leaving that out of the conversation when we talk about Kinder Morgan, that the free market has a significant impact on this. And whether or not this is going forward isn't necessarily about, you know, even all of these aspects that you've included that are a part of a healthy democracy. But it could just be the market for diluted bitumen doesn't exist.
If investors wanted to stick this out because they thought there was a long-term return there that was worthwhile, they could absolutely do that. It seems to be the case that they don't want to do that. And perhaps that's sending some information that people should pick up and think about before they go and say that the rule of law is broken down.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have for Constituency Report. I really want to thank David Moscott for a fascinating conversation on democracy and all things democratic and social. And thank you for joining us today.